Good morning. So my name is Stan Vergeer. I work at the municipality in Kampen. I don't know how many of you actually know where Kampen is. It's a small city laying west of Zwolle. It's in Overijssel, so for most of you it would be in the same province where you're living in as well. I've been working in Kampen for about a year now as my function is officially called Klimaatregisseur, which you could translate as climate director. Well, obviously, I do not direct the climate over there. You could see it a bit as a policy advisor on climate change adaptation. What that exactly has to do, we'll get into a bit later. For those of you who are interested, I have a background in urban planning. I got a bachelor's degree in urban planning and a master's degree in water and coastal management. So I come a bit from a planning background, not from a very technical background. I understood from Johannes that we have a mix of students here between people who are doing the more risk management focused studies and people who are also from a more planning background, I would say. So if you have any questions or if I'm going too fast or if you would like some more background information or something, feel free to just interrupt. You can send a message in the chat, but you can also just turn on your mic and ask me directly if that's the better moment for that. I will turn off my camera now again so that we have the presentation in the full screen. A little bit of background on why we did this lecture and how I actually know Johannes. Kampen and Zwarte Waterland, which is our neighbor municipality, we are involved in an international research project called Evolving Regions. I've put a link to the Evolving Regions website in the presentation as well. Evolving Region is a project where 8 regions in Germany and in the Netherlands do a comparative research on how they deal with climate change adaptation on a regional level. So West-Overijssel is one of those regions, and I'm the contact person for that region, and that's how I met Johannes, because Johannes is through the University of Twente, in combination with the University of Dortmund, is guiding us on the more research level. So that's how we met, and then Johannes asked, so we have this course that might be interesting for you to do a guest lecture about what you are doing in the RIVUS region. So that's what we will focus on today as well. So we're talking about what we are doing in the region, not specifically what I do within my own municipality, but how we cooperate in our region with multiple municipalities and how that is organized on both a national and a regional level. To get a quick overview what the lecture will go through today, we'll start with a short topic on climate change adaptation. I guess for most of you this will be familiar information, but we will see how much introduction you need on that. Then we will zoom out a little bit to the national level, how things are organized there, and then we'll get onto the RIVUS region itself, how it is organized, who is in there, and what we are doing. After that, I will talk a bit about the stress test that we did, which is also kind of the main part of this lecture. I will try to show you the stress test and the results of it as well to you. After that, we'll talk a bit about stakeholder involvement and how we move on towards the risk dialogue with that from now on. In this slide, you also see my contact details. So if any of you have any more further questions or things you would like to know or need help with something, this is where you can contact me. If that is all clear, we'll get into the climate change adaptation itself. So I don't know to which extent you've already discussed this in the lectures that you are having, but I would like to go into the differences between adaptation and mitigation a bit. So this is something that's, especially within a municipality, still confusing to some people. I get asked quite often what climate change adaptation exactly is. And I usually give the answer that I'm basically dealing with everything. You can't hear me at all?
Yes, we can, Stan. It's
yes,
very good. go on.
Okay, all right. I usually answer that question by saying that I deal with all the effects of climate change. So I don't do anything that has to do with preventing climate change from happening, but my role is when climate change has already happened, as it has now, and how we deal with the effects of that. And that comes in 4 different sectors. And there's multiple people having problems with their sounds, I see. I will just continue, and if most of you don't hear me anymore, let me know, Johannes, then I will pause it for a bit. I can't hear you either. Sound is great. All right, I will just continue and see if the other people are catching up after that. Okay, so climate change is causing 4 major impacts on our environment at this moment. First of all, we have an increase in temperature throughout the whole year, so it's getting warmer. Second is that we are having a change in precipitation throughout the year, which means that there will be slightly more precipitation in winter times, but a lot less precipitation in summer times. So what that means in a practical level is that we get drier summers. With the precipitation that falls, we have stronger peaks of precipitation. So even though there is less precipitation throughout the whole year or throughout the whole summer, the showers that we do have are stronger than they have been before. So the peak precipitation is increasing. So it's getting wetter, which you can see at this icon over here. So we have hotter, drier, wetter. And the last effect of climate change is of course, rising sea levels, causing an increased flood risk, which you would say only affects the Netherlands in the western and the north, where we actually have a coast to the sea, and not so much in our region. But this is also impacting the increased flood risk throughout river systems. So to sum it up, the effects of climate change that we have to deal with are warmer summers and winters as well, drier summers, stronger precipitation in a short time, and increased flood risk. Now, how do we adapt to that? I gave 2 examples to kind of get you an idea what I'm dealing with on a daily basis. The first example is on a bit of a more broad level, which is flood risk. I think this system, it is called the meerlaagse veiligheid in Dutch, so multi-layer safety approach. Here you can show quite well what the different steps within adaptation are. So the first step of adaptation against flood risk would be to surround your living area with a dike or another flood risk adaptation measure that can keep the water out. So keeping the water out would be the first step of the multi-layer safety approach. The second step is saying, okay, all right, dikes are no longer helping. We're going to adjust our built environment in a way that floods do not impact us that much. The third layer of multi-layer safety would be evacuation. We're saying, okay, this flood is so severe that we cannot take any measures to prevent it from happening. And it's also so severe that we cannot take measures to reduce the damage while it's happening. So we'll just focus on the evacuation and the safety of the people. Well, this is an example of climate change adaptation, where you basically say the sea level rise or this increased flood risk is happening. So we are trying to adapt our built environment to that to reduce the damage we take from that. Another example, this is also something that I deal with on a much more local scale, you could say. This is actually not within my own municipality. This is from the city where I live in Zwolle. Where there were a couple of people in the neighborhood who had problems with urban floodwater. I don't know if you would really call it floodwater. Basically, very heavy precipitation in summer, where there would fall so much rain in in less than an hour that it couldn't fit in the sewers anymore, and it was flooding the streets, and people were having problems with water in there, coming through the doors and in their basements and stuff. So what they decided to do with multiple people is to make their own infiltration system under the pavement behind their houses to reduce the peak of incoming rain. well, as you can see, this is a very bottom-up approach. It's local inhabitants that want to do something themselves to solve their own problems. The municipality was involved, but only to help them out with some finances. So this is also an example of adaptation. If that is clear now to everyone what climate change adaptation is about and what we do with it, then I will move on to the next slide. And that's where I would like to explain how this is organized on the national level. But in order to explain that, we first need to tell you something about the DPRA. And after that, we will talk about the organization on this. So how many of you have heard about the Delta program? Is that something that you're familiar with? Something you've addressed in other lectures? If somebody could reply on the chat, if this is a familiar thing.
This is Johannes here, Stan. I don't think that was much an issue in the lecturing yet, at least not for the MGO student. So might be good if you explain that very briefly.
Okay, I will give a bit of background then. In 1953, the Netherlands have endured a very heavy flood. It is called the watersnoodramp. It was the biggest disaster we've had in the Netherlands after the Second World War, still up until today. We've had multiple thousands of casualties and billions of economic damage. What basically happened, and now it's quite fine that I have this other map here. As you can see over here in Zeeland, Zeeland basically consists of multiple islands. We've had a combination of multiple days of heavy precipitation with a northwestern storm. So the storm was coming from this side, and that caused the dikes over here in Zeeland to breach. And almost all of Zeeland and multiple parts of South Holland and Brabant were flooded. Well, that was a big disaster. And after that, the government said, like, we're not going to let this happen again. We are going to set up a program to make our country more flood resilient. And that program was called the Delta program. Well, and on this left picture here, you can see one of the famous results of that. Throughout the whole western coast of the Netherlands here, between Zeeland and Rotterdam, there have been constructed big civil structures to basically protect our country against flood and prevent floodings like this to happen again. That was called the Delta program. But the Delta program didn't end when these civil structures have been constructed. It was decided that the Delta program should be reviewed every 5 years to basically check if we are still doing the right thing in our country, if we need to make adjustments to our flood risk systems and water safety on a general level. So this is what the Delta program looks at this moment. The most recent Delta program consists of 5 parts. And they call those parts Delta decisions. So there's 5 Delta decisions right now that are basically smaller programs within the Delta program that deal with flood risk measurements on some level. So we've got flood risk on a general level, which is also the core of the Delta program, I would say. We have the Delta decision for freshwater, which is mostly dealing with freshwater supply within the regions. Then we have the Rhine-Meuse Delta, which is the delta over here, you could say. So that's a targeted area where there are some problems that need to be solved within the upcoming years. Another delta decision is the IJsselmeer area. This area over here. That's also a combination with dropping water levels in summer. How do we deal with freshwater supply for the whole area surrounding it? And last but not least is that Delta decision spatial adaptation. So this is basically the part of the Delta program that deals with climate change adaptation. So for you, I've looked up the official, how would you call it? So the official summary of what this Delta decision is about. And it says it's a new and targeted approach towards a water robust and climate adaptive development of the built environment. So basically what I've just told you, the changes that we are seeing from climate change, so increased heat, increased drought, heavy downpours and flood risk, all of that, we need to adjust and build environment for that. And that is what the Delta Decision Spatial Adaptation, or the DPRA, as we call it in Dutch, is about. Now, how is this DPRA organized? Basically, what they've said, in order to get our whole country climate resilient, so to adjust our built environment to climate change on a national level, we need to do 7 things. And those 7 things are not all linear. We could basically make, let me see, I can draw a line in here, I think. We can make a division between these parts. Oh, this is really nice, sorry. So here I drew a line between the 7 ambitions that they have within the DPRA. The 3 ambitions here at the top, those are linear, and that's something that those are steps that have a timeline. And so we'll start with them. Starting with this image over here, which says we need to do an analysis of the vulnerability of our country, the vulnerability to climate change. That is, this is the part that we would call in the field, we call this the stress test. That's what Johannes addressed as well this morning already. So this is the first step towards becoming climate adaptive, is first getting to see how vulnerable are we to these effects of climate change. The second step that comes after that would be the risk dialogue. And in the risk dialogue, you basically say, okay, we know the vulnerability of our region, but is the vulnerability so, how you would say it, is the vulnerability so high that we need to take measurements against it, or is it on an acceptable level? So that's what you would talk about in the risk dialogue. And when you have finished the risk dialogue, you move towards this step, implementation program, uitvoeringsagenda. This is basically where you say, okay, all the measurements that we've talked about in the risk dialogue and that we decided to do now, we make a summary of them, we put a financial overview of what it's going to cost, we get the finances for it, so that's basically carrying everything out. So these 3 steps are what you could call the timeline to get climate adaptive built environment. Then you might ask, what are these other 4 parts that we have below there? So these are all things that we need to do in the meantime. So all of these steps need to be taken while we are working on the other 3 steps. First of all, that is reguleren en borgen. You could translate it as like pinning it down or making laws out of it. This is to make sure that we also get like our new situations that we have to deal with. For example, these heavy downpours that we get, they mean something for our sewer system. This is something that I deal a lot with on a daily basis as well. So a small step out here. On a national level, it's decided that a heavy downpour that, we call it a T is 100 shower. So you could see that as a shower that happens on average every 100 years. At this moment, that is approximately 60 millimeters of precipitation within 1 hour. That is our T100 shower right now. But due to climate change, this specific kind of shower is changing over time. So we expect that by 2050, this 60 millimeters will have already become 67 millimeters within 1 hour, as the average shower that happens once every 100 years. And by 2080, we expect to be this over 70 millimeters. So this means that this shower, this T100 shower, is changing over time, and that also our sewage systems have to change to be able to accept that kind of water. So that's something that we do within the legalization of the, I don't know if that's the proper word, but I think you get what I mean. Second thing is meekoppelkansen. Yeah, this is a very Dutch word that I don't have a specific English translation for it. Basically, what they want to do over here is anything that happens and that's being done already, you need to have a look if you can also improve the climate resilience of whatever topic you're working on with this. I think this sounds very vague, so I'll also give a practical example of this. within our municipality, we have a road network, and that's being maintained. And every 10 or 12 years, you need to resurface the streets. Wherever you're going to resurface a street, we are going to have a look. Is it possible to make some changes to the street so that it's becoming more climate resilient? For example, could we take a different kind of tarmac that's a bit more heat resilient? Or if it's plastered, can we reduce the amount of plastered surface of the street so that we can have more water infiltration over there? And these are kind of things where we say, okay, this street, it's not something that we are going to remove a whole street and build it anew just to make it climate resilient, because that would be too much of an investment. But we do say that if we are doing that anyway for regular maintenance, we need to include some climate resilience in the plans that we are making. And this, of course, doesn't only count for maintenance, but also for new development projects. Well, the other two are a bit more simple. This step is acting during emergencies. So that's basically, we are trying to become flood resilient in the Netherlands, but if a flood happens, we still need to be able to act and to deal with that. And the last one is stimulating and facilitating. That goes more towards the example that I've showed before with the people that were making an infiltration system behind their houses. This basically says if the local civilians or third parties put up their own initiatives, as a government, you need to be able to support and help them with that. So that's a very rough run through, I would say, 250 pages of DPRA, what needs to be done to get our country climate resilient. Is this all clear to everyone? If we have any questions on this, I would understand. If we don't, then I will move on here.
Then I just thought, well, what the meekoppel kansen, I'm not Dutch, but I would translate it as co-benefits or synergies.
Yeah, I think synergies is a nice way to describe it. Or co-benefits. Yeah, it's basically it's not only benefits, because you also need to put something in there, if I can put it like that.
True.
Synergy is a nice word to put it. Yeah. All right. If that is all clear, opportunity grabbing, someone says here in the chat. That's nice. Yeah. Then we will go towards how this is organized. Now, the DPRA is organized on in a very complicated way, I would say. Even I, as a civil servant who deals with this on a daily basis, find it very confusing from time to time. First, I will show you this image over here. As you can see, there's, I think, 7 shades of color in total. There should be 7 at least. Towards report regions. So these are basically regions that are reporting directly to the national government, to the ministry, about the progress that we're making on the DPRA. So I in Kampen am over here, this municipality. You guys in Enschede, you are over here somewhere. Zwolle would be over here. So we are all within this purple region. This region is called Rijn-Oost, and it's basically Rhine-East region. That's our report region. But then that report region, as you saw, is divided into multiple smaller areas again. And this is what makes it so confusing. And those areas are called working regions or werkregio's. There are 45 werkregios in total, I think, in the Netherlands. And what basically is done is that we said, like, the report regions are too big to carry out an implementation program that becomes almost like a national level already. And so they've split it up into multiple smaller regions. So the regions where I am working is the RIVUS region. Don't ask me why this is called RIVUS, but Kampen is over here. This is actually Zwolle, where the students from Windesheim are. The people who are in University of Enschede are in this pink working region over here. So the working regions are then a division of the report regions. And the working regions also are obliged to do their own stress tests, to do their own risk dialogue, and to make their own implementation program after that. Oh, all right. So our working region is called RIVUS, and that is a bit funny because RIVUS is not only a working region. To be honest, RIVUS already existed before the whole DPRA system was put into implementation. But we have been working together for a longer time already on the matter of sewer systems. So as you know, the sewer systems and basically wastewater collection and transport are responsibilities of the municipality in the Netherlands. The purification of wastewater is a responsibility of the water board, but to collect and transport it is a responsibility for the municipalities. That's why all of you also have to pay your rioolheffing every year. That's basically fitting this purpose. What we have set in the RIVUS region, so that is, I don't know if I have that over here. Yeah, so this is the RIVUS region that our lecture is focused on right now. These 8 municipalities that we see over here, lined in black, these are the 8 municipalities that I've said a couple of years ago. We need to cooperate more, because in the end we're all dealing with the same systems. We all have this topic of wastewater transport, and maybe if we cooperate more on this, we can make it more efficient and we can save money. So that was why RIVUS was originally set up, just on the matter, just the cooperation between 8 municipalities on the matter of wastewater transportation. Then the DPRA came and we had to organize ourselves in regions, in working regions. And then we said in the region, all right, we already have this structure. We have already been cooperating in a good way for multiple years. Why don't we also use the same structure that we have already to deal with climate change adaptation? That is what you can see over here. So this is an organogram. I don't know if that's also the English word, but basically the organization structure table of how RIVUS is organized. So above we have the bestuurlijk overleg. This is where all the governmental representatives, so for the gemeentes, that would be our wethouders, or I don't know how you call it in English, sorry.
Law.
We have some. What did you say?
Lawkeepers.
Lawkeepers. Our lawkeepers, or in German you would call it Abgeordnete, or for the water board that would be the governor. Then we have the stuurgroep, so basically the direction. This is where the directors of all the partners are included in. That is organized in multiple levels. And then in the end, we have expert teams, platforms, and wastewater teams that are all cooperating. Oh, Elderman. Yeah, that is actually the right word. That was what I was looking for. Thank you. So the civil servants that's what you call the ambtelijke partners. So this is where I am in as well. Here we have one of the platforms that we have is the platform for climate change adaptation. So that's not the only platform. There's also a platform on, for example, recycling wastewater and renewable energy from wastewater. All kind of new developments are discussed in platforms to see how we have to do, how we can deal with that in a more efficient way as a region. And climate change adaptation is one of the platforms within the RIVUS in this organization. All right, so a little something about the area that we're in. So here you can see marked in black our area. This is Kampen, the municipality where I work. Zwolle, you know. Zwolle is also the biggest city within the RIVUS region. Another big city here in the south would be Deventer. And the surrounding municipalities around that as well. We have a couple of big challenges in this region, which also makes it a very interesting region to work in. First of all, flood risk. You could say that we are the drain of the IJssel, if you can call it like that. So as you can see, the IJssel moves from Deventer past Oostweijen, past Zwolle over here, onto Kampen, and then goes towards the Ketelmeer here. That is a big discharge, but the IJssel is not the only main river that we have in the system. The other main river is the Vecht. That's coming from Dalfsen towards Zwolle and goes towards Zwarte Waterland and ends here at the Zwarte Meer. So we have two major rivers, and these two major rivers combined with the IJsselmeer that is over here, that we talked about earlier, and makes us a very flood-prone region. Well, you might ask, how does that work then? Well, as you can see, these rivers over here all discharge towards the IJsselmeer. So say if we have a couple of days of very heavy precipitation, or the Vecht and the IJssel, they all derive eventually from Germany. So if Germany has a couple of weeks of heavy precipitation, combined with a northwestern storm from the IJsselmeer over here, you can see that the water combines in this part of the water system. That's why Kampen, Zwolle, Oostweijen, everything that's on these big rivers is prone to flood risk. So that's a big challenge in our region. This is also something that is new, not new, of course. This is something that we've been dealing with for tens, maybe even hundreds of years already. And also something that some big projects have been done on as well in the IJsselvecht Delta. One project that we are particularly proud of, that I will mention here, but you can forget if you want to. It's called the bypass of the IJssel over here. As you can see, this river over here at the Revendiep, that wasn't here until a couple of years ago. Originally, the IJssel fully discharged onto here, but by making an extra bypass towards the Drontenmeer, we kind of reduced the pressure on the IJssel and increased the possibilities of water discharge in multiple directions. This was a very big thing, not only a big infrastructural project, but also politically it was very interesting, because there's been created new nature area, of course, here. But what also happened is that Kampen is now on an island, which wasn't the case before. So this is, for example, something that we have been dealing with as a region for a longer time already. Another interesting thing is soil inclination. This area over here, everything that's purple, you can see are areas that are dealing with increased soil inclination due to drought. Most of these areas are peat areas. As you know, peat areas have a natural soil inclination by themselves. But the thing with peat is that if you drain the water from it, the inclination will increase. So that means that if we have a very dry, see, land subsidence, is that the proper scientific term? Okay, I will say land subsidence then from now. Sorry. So the peat subsides on a national, or no, not on a national, but on a natural level, I mean. But the increased drought in summers means that there's not enough water to keep the peat wet, and that means that it inclines even more than it normally would do. Which results into centimeters and even meters of soil inclination. As you can see this dark purple part over here, the Koekoekspolder, that's an area that's almost 2 meters lower than the surrounding areas by now, because it's been drained for such a long time. So these are some challenges that we have to deal with on a regional level. All right. Now to the main part of the lecture, the stress test. What I would like to explain a bit is how we, first of all, how the stress test was organized. That's going to be a bit dry, maybe. There's a big organogram for this. I will try to run you through it a bit quickly, and then we will have a look at the results of the actual stress test and what came out of it. And that's probably a bit more exciting, I would say. First of all, the approach. I should say that this schedule was not made by ourselves. We've had some help to do the stress test by an engineering company called Tau. Some of you might know it. It's located in Deventer. What they basically did was saying we need to, in order to do the stress test, we need 3 different levels of approaching. First of all, the inventarisatie, basically collecting all the data that we can on the vulnerability of our region. Second part is to interpret all these data, and the last part was to visualize it, resulting in, as the final result, the online viewer that I will show you in a bit. Some of these steps are not very interesting for you, because it's very has to do with the organization that we did it within RIVUS. I think the interesting part comes after the inventarisatie, so after the collecting of the data, is to see which data is relevant and or not. That's shortly drawn in this image over here, but I've got a better one over here. So what we basically did is, for all the data that we have about the impacts of climate change, is to say which of these effects are regional challenges that we have to deal with. Because if something is occurring very locally and the municipality can deal with it itself, it's not a topic that we need to discuss with the whole region and that we need to cooperate about. So they used a system that made it basically go through a couple of questions. First of all, do you need multiple parties from the region to deal with the effect of this, to deal with this effect? Or are multiple parties in the regions needed to take measurements? And if the answer on any of these questions is yes, then you have a regional task that we have to deal with in RIVUS, and not only within their own municipalities. If it's not something that involves multiple parties, we would like to have a look if it's something that occurring at multiple within multiple municipalities. And I think that this is a bit confusing now. What we mean with it, I will give you an example, is for example, drought affecting farm productivity of local farmers. That is something that's it's occurring very locally. So a municipality could deal with it itself, but it's a problem that's occurring within every municipality in the region. Even though the effect is not regional, we all deal with it. So we can also all work together to figure out a way to deal with it. And the top line over here is meant more for things that also occur on a regional level. So say, for example, flood risk or land subsidence that we just learned. And last but not least, there are things that only occurring within a municipality and are not something that all municipalities have to deal with. And then it's not a regional task and the municipality can deal with it themselves. And here we have the example of, for example, very heavy precipitation causing houses to flood in a specific street within a specific city. That's not something that needs to be discussed with on a regional level. Now, you might ask, what are the effects that we're looking at then here at the top? So we need to collect data, but data on what? For that, I would like to show you this tool over here. I think I can share this in a way. Let me have a look. I don't remember how to do this again. Johannes, can I share one of my Chrome?
What are you trying to do, Stan?
So I've opened this link in a separate browser tablet.
Okay.
But how do I open that again from here? I have to close the presentation first.
Yeah,
right?
you have to close the presentation and then you can share your screen.
Oh,
Maybe close the presentation for a minute and then open it up again.
Share your screen. Yeah, here we go. Thumbs up.
Well,
All
that
right.
takes a moment. Now it's
now you're seeing the tool, right?
Not yet. Now we see the tool. Yes.
All right. So this is the tool that basically shows all the effects of climate change on the built environment. So if I select all the effects over here, then we get a lot. So these are all the effects of that climate change have that we, in the ideal world, if we solve all of these issues, we would be a completely climate resilient country. I found this tool really practical because you can make selections on which climate effects you want. So if we, for example, switch these off, now we're only having a look at the effects that heat has on the built environment. And then there's several sectors, and you can even select which kind of sector you want. So say that we have the heat effect combined with infrastructure. It will say the effects that heat has on infrastructure. So that's basically how it works. And what we did was, oh, sorry, now I'm messing it up. I'll go back. Stop sharing your screen and go back to the presentation. Restore presentation. So basically what we did is take all these effects of climate change and for each one of them, run them through this system. So the effect that we see over here, does it involve multiple parties within the area? Is it something that each municipality has to deal with? If not, then it's local and we're not including it in the stress test. That's clear so far. If you have any questions, you can hear it now. And otherwise, we have a look at the stress test itself.
Stan, I just need some clarification. The relationship between those diagram of yes, no, whether it's a regional task or not, and the adaptation tool that you showed. So you use the adaptation tool to figure out what are the sectors that are being affected, and then you decide whether is it a regional task or not. Can you make that clear link, how you use these two together, these two approaches together? That was not fully clear, I feel.
Okay, so I will give you an example. So here's an image that combined drought and basically the whole physical domain. So each of these little balls that you can see over here is one of the effects of climate change. In total, there's more than 100, I think 150 or something. If we take one example of this ball over here says the threatening of cultural heritage, which is a bit of a weird name, but what it actually means is that dropping groundwater tables having a negative impact. So the dropping groundwater tables have a negative impact on the foundations of buildings. As you might know, especially older buildings that have been built in the 16th, 17th century are often using wooden foundations instead of the steel or concrete that we've been using later. So wooden foundations, they are basically permanent unless the groundwater table drops. That causes the wood to rot. And rotting foundations causing the buildings to collapse in some cases. So that's just one of the 150 effects. But we take this effect and run it through the system. So we have the problem of rotting foundations of cultural heritage buildings. Well, the effects are occurring very locally. And so it's not something that involves multiple parties because it will be one building or maybe several buildings within one street in a specific city. So it's not something that multiple parties are involved with, but it is something that we are dealing with in most of the municipalities in the region. So that's something that we said, okay, so it's not occurring regionally, but since we all have to deal with it, we can work together on it to do some research or get more information, get more experience on this. So it is a regional cooperation, as it is called here. I don't know if that makes it any clearer.
Yes, thanks a lot. That makes it now very clear. I think it was good to have this one example. Now, Kazim is asking a question, which is, of course, to be expected, and that is whether this adaptation tool platform is also there in English, but I'm afraid it is not, right? It's only in Dutch.
Yeah, as far as I know, it's only in Dutch. So that's a bit of a pity.
Well, it's a Dutch approach to it. So you can use this platform, Kazim, and to all your others. I added the link also to our Canvas website, course platform. But you will have to translate things, yes, indeed. But it's definitely worthwhile to play around with that. Okay, Stan, I think you can go on now if there are no other questions.
Yeah, then we go to the actual session. is it a general tool that can be applied for any region? So the adaptation tool is made on a national level. So that's the general tool. And it also includes everything that happens in the whole country. So your question, Rudolf, if it's specifically constructed for Kampen, no, because there are topics in it that we aren't dealing with in Kampen. An example of that is, for example, groundwater salinization due to seawater intrusion in coastal aquifers. That's something that we don't deal with in Kampen because we don't have any shoreline. So all the bulbs that are in the adaptation tool are everything that could possibly happen in the Netherlands. So it's going beyond our region. So we've also crossed a couple of these bulbs off that we actually don't even have in our area. All right, I will now go to the stress test results itself. And in order to do that, I will share my screen again. And I will go towards this one. All right, so this the stress test is built as a story map. I'm not a communication expert, but from what I've heard, this is a good way to show the stress test to the wide public. Before I start scrolling through it, I will explain that. I will explain two things. The first thing is that this stress test focuses on the professional. As I said, each municipality has to do their own stress test as well. And that means that we have multiple levels of stress tests. So we have the municipal stress test only for Kampen itself, in this case, but we also have the regional stress test. And something that our alderman said to me before we did all of this, he said, like, I don't want to go out to the public with multiple stress tests because that's going to be very confusing. We only want to have one stress test, and that's going to be our municipal stress test that we share towards the public. And that means that our regional stress test provides important information for policymakers, for engineering companies, for people that actually work with this stuff, but not as a communication tool to spread towards, say, civilians or companies or people that don't need to deal with this on a professional level. So that's also how it was made and also how it was shared. The second thing I would like to explain is that people, the professionals that work with this, are not all experienced in the physical domain. To give you an example of this, I've had my colleagues who gives the permit for big events. He doesn't know anything about the physical domain. He's basically a lawyer who's doing permits, and he doesn't need to know why it's getting warmer or how or to which extent. He just wants to know that it's impacting him. So to deal with these kind of cases, we've divided the stress test into three kinds of images. I will scroll through the first part a bit. Here's some instruction videos on how we did it, but I just explained all of that to you. So these are the three levels of information that we are sharing. First, we have the bird view image, you could say. This is for the sector, the physical domain. In the bird view image, they basically show in one big overview what the impacts of climate change are on the physical domain. So this doesn't give any detailed information or data or even where it's occurring. This is more on a general level to explain what the effects of climate change are for our colleagues. Apologize again, this is also in Dutch, of course, because it was made for our region. I do not have an English translation for this either, but if you need some more information or have some questions on it, feel free to contact me after the lecture. So the first step is always the bird view image. This is especially for the people that do not deal with climate change on a daily level. And the second step in the communication is then the overview map. This is where information gets more physical. So this is the overview map for our region for water and the physical domain, mostly focusing on flood risk. So this starts showing the flood risk maps for our regions. And the idea the idea for this overview map is that you can see at once what areas are at risk. So what areas are vulnerable? You can instantly see that if you look at this map because they are red or orange or yellow. And that's the idea of the overview map, is that you don't have to have exact information, not very detailed, just to get a general idea what areas are vulnerable for a specific topic. And then we have the third layer, and that's the map overview. And this is where people can download all the data that was used as GIS data to use it themselves. So you can see over here, there's a viewer that has multiple topics. We'll select a random one, heat stress, for example. As you can see, all the red areas are areas that are dealing with more heat stress than the surrounding areas. Or say we take supply of fresh water in the summer by 2050. So these are all specific data that was gathered in the first step. I don't know if you remember this big table that I just showed you. The first step was collecting all the data. Well, this is where all the data ended, in these viewers. And that's how it was used. So this is if you need something very specific, need some very specific information as a policymaker or as an advisor for developments, you can get it from here. But the idea is that within these overview maps, you can see at once which areas of our region are vulnerable to specific effects. So I'll quickly run through them because we are also slowly running out of time. This is the map that shows which areas of our region are prone to flood risk. Then we move to nature and agriculture. If this would load. Well, as you can see, the whole area is prone to, no, that was a joke, sorry. We have the red areas, for example, show which areas are prone to drought damage. So farmers that are losing some of their crops because there's not enough freshwater supply. The blue areas are areas that are prone to heavy precipitation, and that means that the crops can get so wet that they die as well, because we don't manage to get rid of the water quickly enough. Here we have the green lined areas are nature areas that don't have any access to freshwater supply in dry summers, marked over here. So another way to see at once, like, what are our vulnerable areas. It's a bit harder to see. Then we have recreation and healthcare. We didn't put that in a map because these are all effects that are not bound to a specific location, but are happening throughout the entire area. And last but not least, we have vital and critical infrastructure. This is basically all the infrastructure that is necessary for people to live in a certain area. And if we lose any of these infrastructures, people will have to be evacuated. So this would mean we're talking about electricity supply, drinking water, the wastewater system, the chemical company sector, all these kind of sectors that we need to keep up, to keep our area running in general. All right, that was very quickly running through the stress test. Oh, I'm doing this wrong again. I have to go back here.
Maybe, Stan, I can quickly add to your presentation and quickly running through it. I have added the link to the story map, which, by the way, is made in ArcGIS now to our students, to also to Canvas. So you can access it there and study the maps that are being made and the analysis. It's again all in Dutch, sorry for that, but you can all have a look at it later if you like in more detail. So the link is on Canvas.
Very good. I will stop sharing my screen. I see that Lisbeth is leaving and she asked if we can receive the PowerPoint. Yeah, I think I can send it to Lisbeth and she can then forward it to the other students from Windesheim as well afterwards. Thank you. A couple more questions. Is it a general tool that can be applied for any region? So it does not work for Bangladesh? No, you are right in that. I think For Bangladesh, of course, some of the effects would be the same that we use in this adaptation tool, but my assumption is that there will be other climate change issues occurring in Bangladesh that are not happening in the Netherlands, so that would need to be added as extra bulbs over there. But the core would be the same with heat, drought, precipitation, and flood risk. Some more questions I see.
No, the rest was discussion and answers to the question that have been raised. I think that's all covered so far, Stan. Please continue.
We're back at the PowerPoint. Now, then we're getting slowly towards the end here. It's also almost 10 o'clock, so that should be fine.
Well, we have a few more minutes. No, you're not in a rush, so we can use a few more minutes.
All right. So this was a question from Johannes about how the stakeholders are involved within this whole process of organizing this. So I'll give some information on that. And then I realized that I also didn't explain completely how we did the stress test, but I will use this image again to explain how the stakeholders were involved. So within the interpretation, so I should start at the first step. So how are the stakeholders involved in the collecting of the data? So basically, we asked all the stakeholders that we have in the area, what information would you find necessary to know considering climate change effects, and what do you have available? And that's how we got all the maps that you saw in the viewer as well. And within the interpretation part, we've organized different tables. So for each of the sectors that you saw in the final stress test, we've organized a table which you could see as a focus group, more or less, where we invited all the involved regional partners or stakeholders to cooperate with us in this table and to discuss what the impacts were exactly and what these maps were showing us. So that was the involvement on the focus groups. I do have to say that the focus groups were all governmental or at least non-profit organizations that were involved there, and not even non-profit, I would say, but it was basically all the stakeholders that do not have a direct belang, if someone can translate the word belang for me, interest, I would say, right? So all the stakeholders that do not have a direct interest were involved in the focus groups. So some examples of this are, of course, municipalities and the water boards, and then also the provincie, so the province, the GGD, that's our regional healthcare institution, the RIVM, that's the National Research Center on infections and public health. Other stakeholders were the Veiligheidsregio, which is our crisis organization for the region that deals with big crises, and several others. And then there were a couple of stakeholders that do have a direct interest, and that's why we said we would prefer it if these stakeholders are not in the focus group, so that they do not dominate the discussion about what is important and what needs to be shown on the map. But we do want to have their input, and we got that input through interviews. So these stakeholders were interviewed separately to kind of keep their points of views out of the discussion, but to include it separately. Some examples of stakeholders here are the nature conservation organizations in the area, some landscape conservation organizations, and also the LTO, which is the agricultural sector representatives. So these were sectors that have, these were organizations that have a clear background and a clear interest in this, so we kept those separate in interviews. And then the last part of the stakeholder involvement was the presentation and feedback. When we finished the stress test, we did a presentation to which we invited all the stakeholders, regardless of their interest or not, to show the results and have some discussion rounds. So each of the overview maps were being plotted on a large sheet of paper, and we had like stand-ups over there where people could discuss the effects and see what they found really critical. And you could see that this was also the first step towards the risk dialogue as well, because as soon as you put on a map with the vulnerability of a region, people start discussing it and say, wait, this is wrong, this is not so vulnerable. The map says over here that this area is prone to drought, but it's actually not. These are the areas that are really vulnerable, we should focus on. So that was basically already the first step towards discussing how do we value these vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities that you could see in the stress test. And that also puts this, so this is a timeline of how we did it. It's mostly the organization. I think I will skip through this for now. It's not very interesting, I would say. It does show how the stakeholders are well involved, but we can leave it out for now. This is what I was talking about, the risk dialogue. So we're moving from the vulnerability impact analysis towards the risk dialogue. And what you basically do in the risk dialogue, is how I like to explain it to people, is that you have a problem and that you decide if this problem is worth investing in measurements or not. Say, for example, the area behind my house, I live in Zwolle, on the edge of Zwolle, and the area behind my house is prone to flood risk. So if a flood happens, approximately a meter or a meter and 20 centimeters of water will be over here, behind the dike where I live. But then you could say, yeah, but all the area over there, it's all farmland. So if that happens, the damage will be very minimal. And the investment that needs to be made to get this whole area defended against flood risk would become billions and billions of euros. So in this case, we would say, okay, there is a risk, but the impact of the risk is very low. And the measurements we would need to take are very expensive. So in this risk dialogue, we would conclude that we are not taking measurements over here. Disclaimer, this is not actually how it goes, of course. This is just to give you an idea of how the risk dialogue could go. And that's the phase we are in right now. Again, we need to address all the stakeholders. So for each of the vulnerabilities that we've seen in the stress test and the vulnerable areas, we need to define the stakeholders. That's what we have been doing for the last couple of weeks after completing the stress test. And then the stakeholders are invited to discuss with us like what kind of measurements could be taken, and what would these measurements cost, and how does that relate to the actual risk and the actual impact of this vulnerability. And eventually, by the end of the year, we should then have an overview of what measurements we want to take and what risks or what vulnerabilities we find acceptable and will not address at this moment. And if I say it like this, it sounds very easy, but it's quite a lot of work. So we will be busy with that for the rest of the year. Last thing I should mention on this is that this cycle of vulnerability impact analysis, so the stress test basically, risk dialogue and implementation program, we are supposed to run through this cycle every 6 years. So we did the first stress test last year in 2019. That means that in 2025 we will do the new stress test. And then we can use the new data that we have available, new models that the climate institution in the Netherlands can give us for example, precipitation or for drought. Maybe new spatial developments that have been done over the next 6 years can be included in it then. So the idea is that this is an ongoing cycle of every 6 years running through the system to see, did we get some new vulnerabilities over the year? Did the old vulnerabilities that we saw on the last test, did we solve them for now? And then see if we need to take new measurements. I see the question, why 6 years? Does this relate to cycles in spatial development planning, for example? It's combined to the cycle of the Delta program as well. And then from what I remember, the Delta program is renewed every 5 years. But it would make sense to me if that is actually 6 years. So I will have to look that up after the lecture. But it is connected to the cycle of the Delta program. And the reason why they chose 5 or 6 years for the Delta program and not 4 years, and that's going to be a bit of a political discussion. But the main reason is that we have elections every 4 years. So we have a government put in place every 4 years. And they find it important that these kind of programs that are preferably non-political, because they deal with facts, they deal with vulnerabilities and addressing these vulnerabilities, but they try to sort of pull that out of the regular cycle of having a new government, to prevent it from happening that within the same coalition period, so government period, they couldn't finish one cycle of the risk dialogue. I don't know if I explained this right now, but I think you get the general idea.
Mm-hmm. There's also a question by Priscilla, Stan. Maybe we can address that. I think the other one was clear now. Yep. Do you see that?
Do you use only climate prediction data or also include past events data? Maybe besides the quantitative aspect. So yeah, how we do it, and now I'm going to talk a bit more about municipal stress test, but I think that kind of gives you an idea of how it works, is that we model, so this would be precipitation data. So we model the T100 precipitation, so the 67 millimeters for 2050, and we put that in a model to see what areas could have problems with that. And then we validate that model by using an event that has happened in the past. So for our assessors in Kampen, we used some specific shower that happened in August 2018, where 45 millimeters of precipitation fell in 45 minutes, which is a bit comparable to the 67 millimeters in 1 hour. And we used the system to check if our model was right and the experience that we had, if they also showed up in the model. So this specific shower from 2018, and that gave us in total, I think, 13 locations that had problems with water, either on the street or within houses. And we checked for these 13 locations if they were in the model to validate that. Don't know if that answers your question. Okay, and yes. I saw one more question from Richard. On the site for Brabant, it is stated that you can make your own bubble diagram with this tool. How can this be done, as the tool does not seem to allow creating a new chart? Then I will share my screen quickly again to explain that. Go back to the adaptation tool. What I mean with that is not that you can kind of make it completely, but you can say if you want to know something about drought and agriculture, and we've got these bulbs, and then you could say, so this is like the basic for drought and agriculture. You could say like, these are positive effects, I don't need them. So you can, before you could click on them to delete them, but that's, oh yeah, sorry, you have to go on to the next step, and then you can click on them to remove them. Say like, I don't find that important, I don't find this one important. Try to rearrange it a bit so that it's a bit more visible. That's what I mean with positioning. Here I did it wrong again, sorry. But it does not mean that you can add new bulbs, to say it like that. So the bubbles or bulbs, they are set, and you can either like shift or remove them, and you can select it per sector, but you cannot add your own things. All right. Yeah, and you can export the end as a PDF. Yes, exactly. So this is my last slide to give you an idea what we are working on right now. As I said, we are in the risk dialogue. Again, the risk dialogue is not just a matter of taking the map and going to the people, although sometimes it comes down to that. Often you need to think a lot about it before, like, what do I actually want to discuss? With whom am I going to discuss this? Are there other regional processes ongoing that I can combine this with? So that's the preparation phase. That's what we are on in RIVUS right now. By now we have made an overview of all the stakeholders that we need to talk to, who is going to talk to these stakeholders, which parties are involved, and also what other regional processes we can include in. The carrying out phase is supposed to happen soon. This is the actual dialogue, so just talking to your partners and stakeholders about vulnerabilities. That was supposed to be going on right now, but as you know, we are with the current corona situations, it's a bit hard to organize these kind of meetings, and we are still in the discussion if we should postpone it until we can meet face to face again, or if we should do it in a digital way, like we are doing this lecture now as well. And then, of course, you have to summarize it up again, prepare for the implementation program already, see what the outcomes of the risk dialogue are. And that's going to happen towards the end of the year so that we can slowly move on to our uitvoeringsagenda, the implementation program. And that will be the final result of this cycle. And then in 4.5 years, we will start all over again to do the same thing. All right, that was in a very short, quick way, running through how we are dealing with climate change adaptation on a regional level. It is very similar to how we deal with climate change adaptation on a local level. A lot of steps are the same. It's just that the topics that we discuss are often different because we make the strong division between the regional topics and local topics. So I hope this was clear to all of you. I don't know if you have any more questions.
Stan, maybe I quickly take over and then organize or moderate the questions. First of all, before we come to that, thanks a lot for this very interesting lecture. That was very super interesting for all of us, I guess. Some of us had to leave already and they all said the same in the chat. So maybe you first take a breath and then drink a little bit of water, because I know talking for an hour is already pretty exhausting. Still, if there are more questions, maybe we can take some of them and clarify things. A lot of things have been discussed during your lecture already, but let me see if there are other questions. And if there are, to the students, but also to the colleagues joining still, just use the chat tool or give us a signal and use your microphone if you have a question to ask. Well, Stan can relax a little bit, refresh his breath and this. Any questions? Nobody typing yet. Many things have been clarified. Saskia is typing. Okay, let's wait for Saskia. Do you see the question, Stan?
Regards to the multi-layer safety approach, is there always an infrastructural part, or can you also have a purely social solution for something? So yeah, the multi-layer safety approach, that's something that is normally used in flood risk. So if you're dealing with flood risk, I would say that especially for the first 2 levels, there is always an infrastructural part. And then the third part, the evacuation, is the social solution on this matter. Do you mean that you would like to apply the multi-layer safety approach to different topics that are not flood risk, or do you mean that there are going to be flood risk solutions?
While he's typing, can you go back to the figure that shows this multi-layer approach, Stan? Because then it's more clear for the others what you're referring to, because they might have forgotten in between.
So yeah, that's this over here.
That figure.
Yeah, because you said I thought the Netherlands was trying to move away from purely technical solutions. That is correct. Well, maybe that's also a bit of a step out then, I would say that after 1953, so after the watersnoodramp, the focus was very heavily on big infrastructural investments in the Netherlands. You were right on that, Saskia. And the motto at that time, so say from the early 60s to the 1980s, the motto was that civilians could go to sleep because Rijkswaterstaat would take care of the flood risk. And everyone can sleep quietly and do not have to worry about flood risk. And that changed in the 90s. We've had more floods in 1993 and 1995. Those were not coastal floods, but there were river floodings in Limburg. And that was the point that the realization came that not everything can be solved by just building bigger walls and bigger dikes and stronger dams. Because the climate is changing, and at some point we are going to, if we have this wall over here, as you can see, and if we just keep increasing it, then at some point we will living behind a wall, and the water is going to be 2 meters above our living environment. So that the 90s was the moment that it was decided that we needed to change our approach and move, instead of fighting against the water, giving the water some space. And that's when the Ruimte voor de Rivier program was set in. So the space for the river, you could translate that. And that is basically already the second layer of multi-layer safety, where you said, okay, instead of building big walls to keep the water out, we are going to give the water some space to flow next to our cities and our important infrastructure, so our roads and our houses. We are going to just build it higher. But our farmlands, for example, we allow that to flood every 10 years to give the water some space and to prevent more severe damage from happening. And I think that's been an approach that's been going on for a longer time already. That we say, like, we cannot do everything in a technical way, but we have to look towards changing the way that we use space as well. And I think that the bypass in Kampen that I showed on this other image, go back a bit. So the bypass over here, that's another example of where we said, like, yeah, we could have chosen to just increase the dikes all around the IJssel over here to prevent it from happening. But instead of that, we've decided we need to give the water some space. It's part of the building with nature approach as well, to decrease the flood risk by just simply letting the water run in a different direction instead of building bigger dikes. And I think that's kind of what you're aiming at, Saskia, right? All right.
Good. Any other questions?
Maybe could I just ask,
Richard,
in relation to that? I mean, the multi-layer safety approach for water is very clear. I think for an issue like heat, it's less clear. I think the infrastructural options are less. At least I'm trying to imagine what they would be. So it's much more then in heat, in terms of heat, about spatial adaptation.
Yeah, so it is an approach that is normally used for flood risk, but for my personal idea, you can also apply it to different fields. So if you would take heat, as an example, I would say the first step of preventing ourselves against heat is by simply reducing the temperature in a certain area. There are several ways to do that. The most effective one, I should say, is by planting trees. Trees evaporate water and therefore reduce the temperature of the area around them. They also provide shade. So you could see that this is the first step, is by planting trees to reduce the heat from happening at a specific point. Second step is accepting that the heat is there and changing the way that you use your area so that the impact of the heat is less. Here you could say that specific groups are more vulnerable to heat than other ones. We know that elderly people are very vulnerable to heat stress, but also infants and people with chronic diseases. So you could say, for example, if we have a hotspot, like we have like 3 big hotspots in Kampen that get very warm in summer. And so these are the 3 areas that we would prefer to not build our elderly homes or kindergartens. And the last step is the evacuation part. And if you apply this to heat, yeah, evacuating for heat is something that's not really necessary because people naturally do it. But you could here you could think about having a big event and canceling it because it is too warm. We've had the city party in Kampen last year was shortened from 5 days to 3 days because we had this big heat wave happening, and it was not responsible to have people partying in the city with this heat. So that's something you could think about. But then again, that's more from a practical point of view. In general, theoretically, the multi-layer safety approach is mostly used in flood risk.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but you can interpret it and use it in other areas as well.
Yeah.
Okay, last chance to pose a question to Stan. Let me see. It doesn't look like there are any more questions, which is great. And still, I mean, as you said already, Stan, if there are other questions popping up later, we can always contact you. So we meet anyhow in the course of the project. So I guess I can also get an answer later from you. If that's not the case, if there's no other question, I once again first would like to thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. And I'm sure there is a button we can give you some applause. So if you all go for checking our icons and saying applaud, you get a big hand, and you get also a lot of comments from the chat now. Thanks very much, Stan. I'm going to stop the recording now because the lecture is basically over.